Right. Good afternoon. On behalf of the Department of History and the Committee for Early Modern Studies at Pennsylvania State University, it is my pleasure and delight to introduce Professor Agoston of Georgetown University. Professor Agoston is a historian of the early modern Ottoman Empire with a focus on its Western frontier region in Central Europe. His first book in English, Guns for the Sultan, marked a watershed in Ottoman historiography. It debunked age-old claims about the alleged inferiority of the Ottoman arms industry. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, he argued, the Ottoman army was, quote, one of the best organized, paid, and supplied in the world, end of quote. The book cemented Professor Agoston's status as one of the world's leading authorities on early modern warfare and Ottoman-Habsburg relations. Aside from his countless other books and articles published in English, Hungarian, and Turkish, Professor Agoston has trained generations of Ottoman historians who now teach in Turkey, Hungary, and the United States. I am honored to consider myself one of Professor Agoston's former students. We're meeting today to hear from Professor Agoston about his much anticipated book, published 4 months ago by Princeton University Press, The Last Muslim Conquest, the Ottoman Empire and its Wars in Europe. His book talk today, which will last 30 to 40 minutes, will be followed by a 5-minute commentary by Professor Virginia Agoston of McMaster University. Professor Agoston is one of the doyens of Ottoman history today. Her book, The Ottomans, 1700 to 1923, An Empire Besieged, just came out last week. And I cannot think of a better person to put for us Professor Agoston's book into perspective. Without further ado, I am so happy to invite Professor Agoston to our virtual podium. Professor Agoston.
Thank you very much, Faisal. And thank you very much, Penn State University's History Department and the Committee for Early Modern Studies. I'm honored to see so many friends, colleagues from Turkey and from the United States. And it's really, the COVID helped us to reconnect virtually. This is an interesting day because yesterday I was in Istanbul. I was in Istanbul virtually because yesterday was October the 7th. And there was a seminar to commemorate the 450th anniversary of the Battle of Lepanto, which you might know. And I'm honored. This is my first book talk, and it's very appropriate that it was organized by Faisal, one of our best and most innovative PhD students, now colleagues. I say "are" because I played only a minor role in his training. Professor McNeil, and prior to that, Alan Mikhail, trained him as an excellent environmental historian. And in fact, he didn't even need me, not even for learning the Siyakat, which is not an easy writing. So I am honored to be here. Thank you for Faisal, Penn State University, and all my colleagues who are with us. I understand that there are a lot of historians who are not historians of the Ottoman Empire. So I try to be clear what this book is about and what my field of research is. And I also heard that there are many graduate students. I'm gonna share my screen. I have a couple of PowerPoints. So this is the book, The Last Muslim Conquest. As Faisal told you, I started as a military historian of the Ottoman Empire. And for graduate students, you have a plan. I wanted to study the Muslim cultural life in the Balkans and in Hungary. Then I went to the Ottoman archives. I couldn't find enough sources, but I found all these sources, account books, very boring accounting, ledgers about Ottoman: gun manufacturing, gunpowder production, saltpeter production, which is a major constituent of gunpowder. And then after 10 years or so, and some 10 trips to the archives, I thought that I had enough material to engage larger question and to understand the Ottomans' role in the so-called gunpowder or military revolution. In those days, those were the buzzwords. But I was dissatisfied because they talked about the Ottoman Empire as a backward empire, as a third-tier producer, which was unable to follow the military developments in Western Europe. And the result of that research, 10 years research, was this book that Faisal mentioned, which really questioned some of these old views about Islamic and Ottoman warfare, their inability to follow the West, and so on and so forth. And I tried to I tried to prove my what I have learned. I organized some 100 tables. Again, those are very, very boring tables, but they gave us the statistical evidence that demonstrated that the Ottomans were self-sufficient in weapons and ammunition production, which resulted in firepower and even military superiority over the European and Middle Eastern rivals. That is, their superiority until the late 17th century, because neither my monograph, none of the revisionist Ottomanist literature, of which my book was only a small part, and many of the authors of that revisionist literature are with us today, was unable to satisfactorily explain the eclipse of Ottoman military power by the Ottomans' two major regional rivals, the Habsburgs, the Habsburg monarchy, and Romanov Russia. My search to understand this divergent path that the Ottomans, the Habsburgs, and the Romanovs took led me to my second book project. And here is the story of the book. Every book has a story. My initial goal was to examine the military and fiscal transformations in the Ottoman Empire and the Habsburg monarchy and Muscovite Russia, as I was convinced that such an approach would yield a more realistic assessment of Ottoman strengths and weaknesses, that comparing the Ottomans to the paradigmatic Western powers whom the Ottomans did not fight in the 16th and 17th centuries. So the original title was Clash of Empires, Ottoman Wars and the Emergence of Habsburg Central Europe, because I wanted to show the impact that the Ottomans had upon the formation of the Habsburg monarchy, its institutions, and its military. And the idea came from the then editor-in-chief of Princeton University, Brigitte van Reinberg, who either there was a AHA meeting or a MESA, I don't remember, but she sent me an email that she would be at Georgetown and wanted to talk about my project. I told her what I was working on, and we signed a contract late 2012, and the delivery date was a very optimistic delivery date, 2 years after. I don't want the graduate students to follow me. You should follow Faisal, who turned his dissertation in just 1 or 2 years into an excellent book. It took me much longer. But in the meantime, this book changed a lot, partly in conversation with the editors who wanted to now pitch the book towards a more general audience, hence the title. I'm happy to talk about the title if you have questions about it. I got some criticism for that. Anyway, so now I envisioned this book project as a more ambitious project, one that now included both military and soft power, and aimed at understanding the profound impact that the Ottomans had on early modern Europe. My editors again encouraged me to pitch the book to a broader audience by including more political history and more wars. And the result is this book, The Last Muslim Conquest, the Ottoman Empire and its Wars in Europe. Originally, my title was just the Ottoman Empire in Europe. And if you have questions, I can answer how it became the Last Muslim Conquest. This book almost twice the size of the original project, and it took me twice the time. With the book, I also returned to my earlier research interests, Ottoman Habsburg imperial rivalry, Ottoman intelligence gathering and diplomacy, which I view as soft power, and Ottoman borderlands, topics I have been publishing on since the 1990s. The Last Muslim Conquest synthesizes my research and contributes to many subfields, I hope, of history, including early modern Ottoman and European history, comparative study of empires, frontier borderland studies, and the new diplomatic history. It also engages in some heated debates of the past decades about Islam and Europe. I reject the clash of civilization narrative by demonstrating the Ottoman Empire's multi-ethnic and multi-confessional character and its entanglements in Europe, not only as an enemy, as a military challenge, but also as an imperial rival and occasional ally. But the book also rebuffs recent distortions, what I think distortions of Ottoman history that have turned Ottoman sultans into Renaissance princes and blurred the cultural fault lines between Islam and Christendom. I argue that while the Ottomans were an integral part of Europe, in many sense, they were a European power, a European empire, theirs was a polity principally shaped by Turco-Iranian and Islamic models. I also complicate earlier state-centered histories of the Ottoman Empire by paying attention to provinces and giving agency to lesser-known actors, martial lords, frontier raiders, viziers, advisors, provincial governors, soldiers of fortune, surveyors of revenues, tax collectors, diplomats, diplomatic interpreters or translators, and so-called imperial go-betweens and spies. And I divided the book into, I organized the material into 4 major parts. The first, what I call emergence, and you can see the table of contents. These are the issues I am studying here. I hope that these chapters contribute to the literature about the formation of the Ottoman Empire. I consider how historical contingency and accidents and the various strategies of conquest contribute to the Ottoman dynasty's emergence. Of these strategies, I study dynastic marriages, traditionally thought to be a distinctly European practice, religious accommodation, and the incorporation of the conquered people and their institutions into the Ottoman leadership and institutions. I also engage in a centuries-old debate concerning the significance of Islam in the rise of the Ottomans, a notion that in our global age of multiculturalism had been discredited. While I'll accept that the Ottomans emerged in a multi-ethnic and multi-confessional milieu, I argue that the Ottoman elite used Islam and the idea of holy war to support the Ottoman dynastic enterprise. This was not unique, as the Ottomans' Muslims and non-Muslim rivals employed similar religious rhetoric for loyalty creation and dynastic legitimization. Threatened by the Ottoman conquest, Albanians, Croatians, Hungarians, and Poles formulated their self-image as bulwark of Christendom, antemurale Christianitatis, against the infidel Turk, infideles Turcos. The images of self as defined against the Turkish other were then disseminated through political propaganda and became part of emergent national myth in Europe, influencing thinking about Turks and Muslims to this day. And you can see this rhetoric now from right-wing politicians everywhere in Europe. I also engage historians of Hungary, Southeastern Europe, and Central Europe. I build on their works because I wanted to show their significant contributions to the study of the Ottoman Empire. I show how attempts to halt the Ottoman conquest resulted in crusades and dynastic unions under the Luxembourgs, the Jagiellonians, and the Habsburgs, and how the Ottoman pressure pushed these people towards military and fiscal reforms in Hungary and later in the Habsburg monarchy. So these are the first chapters. I'm not going to show you, but the question is why the small principality here, the Principality of Othman, would become the Ottoman Empire and none of the neighboring principalities, many of which were stronger than the Ottoman Empire. These are the traditional explanations. I try to combine that. I don't like monocausal explanations. Marriage alliances, none of this is my original contribution, but what I wanted to show how important marriage alliances were for the Ottomans, but also that it was marriage alliances were used by the Ottomans' opponents, by the Serbians, or by Trebizond or the Akkoyunlu sultans who were using similar strategies. So it's not unique. If you put it into a larger context, you will understand better the similarities and also the differences. And I have some very interesting studies how the Ottomans used, for instance, how Murad II used marriage alliance and his Orthodox wife, Tsaritsa Mara, to save the Ottoman Empire when it was threatened in 1444, when there was a major crusade against the Ottoman Empire, and also the Karamanid Emirate in Asia Minor attacked them. I studied these institutions, which are crucial. And my point is that by the time the catastrophe, the defeat of the early Ottomans at the hands of Timurlane happened, they already had in place these institutions which saved the empire. The second major part of the book deals with the clash of empires. And I examine how rivalries between the Ottomans, the Habsburgs, and the Safavids of Persia, and the Ottoman, Habsburg, and Ottoman Safavid wars that usually have been studied separately, were closely related. I discuss how Sultan Sulayman's victory at Mohács helped the Habsburgs to acquire a long coveted thrones of Hungary and Bohemia and establish the Danubian Habsburg monarchy, how the Habsburgs' multiple engagements in Europe and the Ottomans' rivalry with the Safavids resulted in a Habsburg-Ottoman stalemate and the partition of Hungary. Having compared Ottoman military commitments against the Habsburgs and against the Safavids, I demonstrate Safavids with those against the Portuguese in the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. I demonstrate that these latter theaters, that is the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, the Ottoman government's policies remain limited in scope and in objectives. These sections of the book engage some revisionist and imaginative scholarship that claims otherwise. Now, the editors wanted more wars, and I am using 5 wars, which I call the decisive battles. Military historians often talk about decisive battles. If there were decisive battles in the early modern era, these were the ones. And I am happy to talk about why these were important, not just the formation of the Ottoman Empire, the conquest of Constantinople, for instance, how it made the previous frontier principality into a patrimonial, more centralized empire, but at the same time, how it reshaped Mediterranean power politics. It affected the relationship between Genoa and Venice, and so on and so forth. I don't want to go into detail. And this is why it was important for the Ottomans. And you can see that prior to the conquest of Constantinople, the Ottomans reached the Danube and had reached the Euphrates, but they lost those territories after the defeat at Ankara. But after that, after the conquest of Constantinople, these conquests remained for centuries. Another, I'm not going to go into detail, but it was tremendously important for the growing of the Ottoman Empire, and it turned the originally Turkoman confederation of the Safavids into a Shia Persian empire in the next 200 years. So it reshaped geopolitics. And Mohács, again, after Mohács, it was not the Hungarians' middle power in late medieval Europe, but it was the new Habsburg monarchy which the Ottomans faced. After the clash of empires, the next section deals with the sinews of empire. Here I return to many of my earlier military history topics. I examine how Ottoman military superiority in the 16th century spurred military modernization and administrative centralization in the Habsburg monarchy. I study how the Viennese government's dependence on the estates and in financing, manning, and supplying its anti-Ottoman defenses perpetuated a system of military devolution and administrative decentralization, which maintained the distinct political, constitutional, and cultural institutions of the Habsburg kingdoms and dominions. So I call it the double effect of the Ottoman conquest. On the one hand, the Ottoman pushed the Habsburgs towards centralization, but the other hand, since the resources of the Habsburgs were insufficient, they had to negotiate with the estates and perpetuate the privileges of the estates. And it's important for understanding the spread of Lutheranism, the Protestant churches in Hungary and in Austria as well. Still, I argue that Habsburg reforms and the cooperation with the estates increased Habsburg military capabilities, both qualitatively and quantitatively, resulting in the reconquest of Hungary at the end of the 17th century, and the Habsburg monarchy's emergence as Central Europe's leading power. I also examine how and why the Ottomans followed the reserve path. During the long wars against the Habsburgs, Safavids, and Venetians in the 17th century, the Porte, the Ottoman government, relied on provincial governors and grandees to mobilize and provision soldiers and raise the necessary funds. Owing to the deterioration of the traditional prebendal system, the so-called Timar system, the backbone of the Ottoman military and provincial administration in previous centuries, the sultans became increasingly dependent on local elites in maintaining law and order in the provinces and raising and provisioning armies. These developments fundamentally changed the outlook of the two empires. By the 18th century, or the second half of the 18th century, the Habsburg monarchy emerged as a military fiscal state, whereas the Ottoman Empire evolved into a limited monarchy. I also conclude that Istanbul's intelligence gathering, because I am in chapters 10 and 11, as you can see, I examine the so-called soft power, Ottoman lawfare, which functioned very, very well in the 16th century, as long as the Ottomans could back their demands with military power. But I see a similar shift if you study the Ottoman European diplomacy, Ottoman Habsburg diplomacy. I conclude that Istanbul's intelligence gathering never reached the efficiency and sophistication of the Venetian, Spanish, or Austrian counterparts. It was too decentralized, relying on intelligence network of grand viziers, provincial governors, and grandees who employed agents of questionable expertise and loyalties. Reliance of renegade and Phanariot interpreters, translators compounded the deficiencies of Ottoman intelligence gathering. The absence of permanent embassies and professional, well-trained diplomatic corps also proved a significant handicap. The fractured nature of Ottoman intelligence gathering made it impossible for Istanbul to turn information, which was very, very good, into a systematized knowledge about their enemies, about their enemies' strengths and weaknesses. So you can see a shift in military power towards the Ottomans' rivals, the Habsburgs, and you can see a more professional diplomatic corps, a more professional intelligence gathering in the Habsburgs that were able to create a huge body of knowledge about the Ottoman Empire, its weaknesses, its resources, how the government functioned, so on and so forth. And you can see the shift around the 16th century, where the Ottomans were forced to conclude a peace treaty on Habsburg territory. That was unheard. Previously, the Ottomans forced their rivals to come to Istanbul. Do you want to make a deal with us? Come to Istanbul, back for your peace, back for your privileges, and we decide what we would do. That is changing. So the gradual change at the end of the 16th century it's visible not just militarily, but on the level of lawfare and intelligence gathering. Now the last section, I returned to the frontiers. I studied the same issues, how the Ottomans and the Habsburgs were managing their borders, and what can we see in terms of shifting powers. In fact, that one, the Habsburgs are covering a previous chapter, but now I focus on the Ottoman border management, frontier management, and I hope that there are some novelties here, even for my colleagues, in terms of border demarcations, geography and border defense, and administrative strategies. As we see it again, we can see that by the 17th century, the Ottomans still able to maintain a much larger military presence in Hungary along the Habsburg-Ottoman border, which had the largest concentration of garrisons and garrison soldiers anywhere along the Muslim-Christian divide. But you can see the problems that the Ottomans were facing in terms of the quality of the troops and in terms of financing these provinces. The local resources could finance only 1/3 or half, depending which province you are looking in Hungary, of the costs of maintaining this military presence. The concluding chapter, Wars of Exhaustion, study how these shifts affected the outcome of the wars against the Ottomans' rivals. And I finish with the wars of the Holy League, and which I go a little bit further because it was in 1718 when the border again becomes the Danube. The Ottomans lost Hungary, the Habsburgs gained all this territory. And it also affected, I have a couple of sentences only, how it affected the Habsburg monarchy, because as long as the Ottomans are in Hungary, this vassal principality managed to challenge the Habsburgs because the Ottomans were supporting. When the border becomes here again, the existence of the Principality of Hungary would end, and the Habsburgs were incorporate these territories into their empires, which would make the Habsburgs one of the largest and most powerful Central European powers by the 18th century. Briefly, these are the things I wanted to mention about the book and book's contributions, and I'm happy to answer questions. But I understand that first Virginia Aksan would comment, which is an honor. In fact, Ginny takes over where I finish around 1700, and she is the best expert on Ottoman warfare and the Ottoman Empire and its relations to Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Agoston, for such a wonderful talk. There were many slides. I was hoping that can Gabor just say more about this slide, especially the one you're in the canon. So I want to hear the story at some point. So I am now delighted to invite Professor Aksan to our virtual podium to offer her commentary.
Lovely to see you, Gabor, and everybody else who's there. Can you hear me?
Yes, I'm muting myself.
Yeah, I'm sitting against the mountains of Vermont at the moment, in case you're wondering where I am. I'm thanks to Faisal, who not too long ago asked me to do this. So I hope it isn't a surprise to you, Gabor. and to Penn State for letting us hear Gabor on his great new book. I do not think there is a better contemporary scholar on the Habsburg Ottoman military context writing in English than Gábor Ágoston. His linguistic and archival range is enormous, and I'm terribly envious of it, as I always have been. His knowledge of military power and the transfer of military imperial knowledge is unparalleled on the Ottoman capture of Hungary or the Safavid-Ottoman confrontations, and certainly on the Austro-Hungarian conflict. The subject represents, of the new book, represents all of those things and much more. It seems to me it offers fascinating insights on the materiality or material of war and the tools of empire. In terms of diplomacy, I've never seen it quite covered so extensively. Nomenclature, borderlands, military technologies, transfer of military knowledge and expertise, and even the postal systems. I do love your comments on the Ottoman inability to collect the knowledge they need to move forward on strategy, and I think that continues until Selim III probably, when he suddenly decides he's sending all of his experts. And they weren't experts, unfortunately, all of the ambassadors to Europe to come back with that information. But his narrative about religious difference is also an antidote to some of the more resilient tropes about the Ottomans and the sensationalist narratives, even now, that read more like Game of Thrones than more circumspect history, as he himself suggests here and in the book. Mostly, this narrative is a record of tremendous cultural and regional diversity and cross-cultural opportunities for elites who make it into the sinews of power. It also incorporates the accommodations and compromises they must make to thrive and survive. Call it the politics of negotiations between subject and ruler, regardless, in the earlier periods, of religion. The place, the author, the subject, and now the place is so memorable to all of us. The map, the geography of the borderlands that he is discussing, it is in these interstices that revolutions and reforms actually occur, as communities find their boundaries restricted. And we know this from all the work that's been done on borderlands frontiers and the last frontier, on the last frontier of Europe, as it is called. There's no better place to understand this than to stand on the ramparts of Esztergom Castle, north of Budapest, where the Danube River turns sharply left to Europe, where the spires of the enormous Orthodox cathedral rise up over the remains of the old Ottoman fortress. And imagine the ghosts of all the stones, imagine the ghosts of all those civilizations that those stones have seen. It's an amazing kind of global spot to stand and think about what has transpired. So if you haven't made Hungary yet, you need to get there. Gabor has that map imprinted on his psyche, and it is very evident in every aspect of this new book. I'm deeply envious. So my further question is, why now? Why are the Ottomans so popular? Why is an amazing kind of, is it just a maturation of discipline? What's happening? What is there relevance to what we're doing, Gabor? That would be kind of unusual. But why? And then I would ask you particularly, why stop at 1700? And I know the answer is exhaustion more than anything else in terms of writing. But the system, as you even acknowledge yourself, was not quite exhausted. You see the last Janissaries on the fields in 1768, 74. So the periodization question is still a big one, it seems to me. And as you acknowledge, the boundaries even of Austria and Hungary are expanded somewhat. But it is a breaking point because of the establishment of those first firm borders between Austria and the Ottomans. So this is more a question for classroom use, because as you say, our publishers want us to be able to reach our students, undergraduate and graduate now. So what is the major classroom problem with the way we argue some of these questions of periodization? And then, of course, you said you would address questions about why you call it the last Muslim conquest. And that brings me to religion, of course. When we started in military history, it was, and really I have acquired most people who are interested in my work out of European military historians than Ottoman historians. Your fellow Europeanists were always forcing us to cast it all in terms of Gaza and the attack of Islam. Has that changed, do you believe, in the new military histories of Europe? I'm speaking of not just of the Ottomans. I believe we're seeing a change, and I believe partially it's because of the bicentennial of the Napoleonic era, and also recently the World War I centennial, which is producing a tremendous amount of new work. So it's not a question, but a comment, but I wonder if you have some comments about that. And finally, what was the hardest part about writing the book?
You're muted, Gabor.
Thank you very much, Jenny, as always. Very, very good comments and excellent questions. The last Muslim conquest. I hear that some of my colleagues in Europe are not happy with this, because especially those on the right, they claim that, what is she talking about? The last Muslim conquest is going on now as we speak with the immigration. And I said, wait, no. I'm a historian. I'm not a politician, although I could have become a politician, because some of you know that after the changes, I shared my office at the university with two other professors. One became the first Minister of Defense of the freely elected Hungarian government. The other became our ambassador to Brussels. And adjacent room, there was a younger fellow who became the Minister of Culture in the first socialist government that came back. But I never was a member of any of those parties. And I didn't meant to provoke, but if it is a provocation, well, be it. What I really meant, it was the last real conquest with arms, with armies, where the Ottomans reached their furthest point in the 16th and 17th centuries. And then, and it's very, very important for people in Central Europe. It's not just the Hungarians, it's for the Austrians, for the Slovakians, for everyone. And it really shapes, I have some notes how it is everywhere, the so-called Turkish wars, it's in literature and everywhere. So, and just a small note about Esztergom, but it's there for the Turks as well. I remember as a young fellow, I was working as an interpreter for the Turkish and Hungarian military. And we were standing on the ramparts of Esztergom and looking down the Danube at the then Deputy Minister of Defense. Later, he became the chief of the general staff, organal archivicolo. He told, who was a Western educated, the representative of the laik government and the guardian of Atatürk's Turkey, he turned to his officer colleagues and said, so our boys came as far as this. Our boys meant the Janissaries. So this is, you asked about the relevance of Ottoman history. It's not just the politics in Turkey and the neo-Ottomanism of the present government, but it's everywhere. You know, Milosevic used the Battle of Kosovo as a rallying cry to mobilize his Serbian nationalists. We have celebrations and conferences. Yesterday we had the Battle of Lepanto, but we had for every single major battle or the death of Suleiman, the birth of Suleiman, and so on and so forth. So history matters more for people in that region, in the Middle East in general, in Turkey, and in Central and Southeastern Europe. Periodization. These are artificial dates that we pick, and we have to stop somewhere. But I believe that certain dates really kind of turning points. I still believe, you know, we were talking about whether we can choose 1453 as a turning point. I believe that it's a symbolic for many reasons, and we can talk about this for the region, for the Ottoman Empire as well. If you look at the 10 volume, which is in fact 20 volume because every single volume is 2 volumes, History of Austria, you know, the early modern era by Thomas Winkelbauer is from the Battle of Mohács, 1526, and the recapture of Buda, 1686. I think we have to go at least to Karlovitz and or Pozsarabats in this, because this is when the last Muslim conquest ended for Central Europe. The Ottomans stayed in the Balkans, but then you have to stay until the First World War or the Berlin Congress. I couldn't do that, but something fundamental changed during the Long War at the end of the 17th century, which ended with the Karlovitz Peace Treaty, which for diplomatic history, we all know it's a major turning point, and with Pozsarabats. So this is why I stopped there. And yes, exhaustion. So I have been working on this book too long, and you know, it became twice the size of the original contract. Adding the either 1 or 2 more chapters and bring the narrative, because, you know, economic historians, Mehmet Genç, Şevket Hoca, and others, they would say that from an economic point of view, the major change comes from around the middle of the 18th century or after. So it depends what you prioritize. For a military historian and the historian of the diplomatic relations between the Habsburgs and the Ottomans, I think Karlovitz or Pozsarabats is a good stopping point. But if you pick, you know, economic history, you have to go further. If you include the Russians, who were part and joined the Holy League, and they were part of this last war, then you have to bring the narrative maybe until Küçük Kaynarca. But you are doing that, and you are doing that much better than I can do. So, and would have required another couple of chapters, and that would have been an unmanageable book. I hope I answered the questions. Yes, go ahead.
I'm sure you have plenty of questions waiting in the wings. I was just going to say, the problem with my new book, not to interrupt here with my book, but to say that the original Ottoman Wars book was the size of your current one, and the press told me to cut it in half. So you can imagine, you know, the same kind of problem.
They were very generous. Every year around December, I got a very kind reminder that the deadline, they didn't even mention the deadline. Brigitta was asking how I was doing with the book, and they were very, very patient. But graduate students, don't do this. Obey the deadlines.
Yeah, my original contract was from 2015, so that tells you something.
You see, and I don't want to name the names, but when I signed the contract with Brigitta was so happy. I said, oh, I just signed 2 other contracts. One monograph for Suleiman, one monograph about millenarism, and one monograph about the Ottoman history. Those are still in the making.
Wonderful. Before I yield the floor to everybody, I just want to make sure that this amazing book just came out last week by Professor Virginia Agoston. And I cannot wait to get hold of it. So just so you know, this is the person who just gave us some commentary. All right, so I'll open the floor for questions. You can raise your hand or you can ask them in the chat box. It's really up to you. I have my own questions. So yeah, feel free to raise your hands or type in the chat box. Until you do, I have a question. So we have many faculty and grad students in our department at Penn State who work on early modern religion, Catholic missions, and other things. So we're interested on Ottoman impact on Europe. So how would you describe the role of the Ottoman Empire in the Reformation? So how did Martin Luther view the Ottomans and the Turks at the time? And how did the Ottomans, did they try to manipulate or tip the scales in favor of one over another? So yeah, so how did Martin Luther and the Pope and the Catholic Church view the Turks? And also what role, if any, the Turks were doing as they witnessed their enemy in Europe being embroiled by religious controversy?
There are books on these topics, as you know. And so the Catholic Church was very, very active. We think about the Crusades, that the Crusades ended with the Fourth Crusade, or with the end of the Crusader states when the Mamluks kicked them out at the end of the 13th century. But we have the later Crusades, many of which were declared against the Ottomans. And I talk about one of these Crusades, which is very interesting because Mehmed II, who conquered Constantinople and gained such a prestige, 3 years later failed at Belgrade, which was a key fortress back in Hungary. And because there was a relief army, there was no relief army in 53 to relieve the Byzantine capital. But there was, and that was a Crusader army. And just in parentheses, those of you who visit Europe or happen to be at a Catholic university like this one, I was here at 12, and of course we hear the noon bell ringing. That goes back to this event when the Pope ordered that everywhere in Christendom they should ring the bells so that they give moral support for the Crusaders. So it's everywhere. The crusading rhetoric. When the Ottomans conquer Bosnia and part of Hungary, there are multiple missions by the papacy, so-called canonica visitatio, where the Pope sent its own people to describe the status of Catholics, and of course the Lutherans by that time, or the Calvinists by that time. There are Franciscan missions, the Bosniak Franciscans, and these are excellent sources for us to understand the religious composition of certain lands, including Bosnia and Hungary, southern Hungary, and so on and so forth. Now, I believe that the Ottoman Empire's pressure played a crucial role in the spread of Protestantism, because the Habsburgs, it tied down the Habsburg resources. But if you look at the minutes of the Reichstag, the parliament of the Holy Roman Empire, you will see that the religious issue is number one. The Turkish threat is only number two. So they want taxes and they want revenue, the emperors to deal with the Reformation. That changes around 1555 with the Augsburg Peace Treaty and with the resignation of Charles V as Holy Roman Emperor, when he gives his authority to his younger brother, Ferdinand of Habsburg, who was King of Hungary and Bohemia, who was fighting against the Ottomans in Hungary and building his Danubian Habsburg monarchy. Ferdinand, and after that, as you know, it is the Austrian branch of the Habsburgs who would give the Holy Roman Emperors. Then it changes. There is a compromise with the Protestant churches, and now the Holy Roman Emperor is Ferdinand, who is facing the Ottomans in Hungary. Vienna becomes the Reich's capital, the capital of the Holy Roman Empire, and Vienna's defense is crucial. After that, if you look at what they want the support for from the estates in the Holy Roman Empire, that's the Turkish war, and the Türkenhilfe, the Turkish aid from the Reich becomes a major component, and this becomes the most important topic to discuss. But by that time, the Protestantism is spread in especially the Lutheran form in what is today Slovakia, what is today Hungary, and parts of Austria. And it is spread because the Habsburg needed the estates. And they needed the estates money. They needed the estates private armies to defend Vienna and the Habsburg monarchy against the Ottomans. All these states are elective monarchies. The king, the Habsburg king, sends his points that he wanted to discuss at the parliament with the estates. He wants money, but the estates say, we give you the money after you compromise and accept that we are Lutherans, we are Catholics, and you don't interfere. It is only in the second part of the 17th century when the Habsburgs felt strong enough to start a Catholic renewal, or we Protestants would like to say that counter-reformation. So the Ottomans are crucial in that issue. About Luther, as you know, Luther first propagated that this is a punishment. The Ottoman success, the Ottoman expansion, is a punishment because of our sins, and the church has no business here. Is the governments who had to fight against. He changes, by the way, he changes his views, but it's not so much Luther that matters here, but the local churches and the spread of Lutheranism. Whether the Ottomans aided and had a strategy, I am unsure. Going back to the 1920s, 1930s, there were doctoral dissertations and books written in Hungary and Austria about this issue. As far as I know, nobody could prove that there was a consistent policy on the part of the Ottomans to support the Lutherans. In principle, that's the policy. The Habsburgs are Catholics, the main enemy of the Catholics, so they would support the Protestant princes, and it happens. By the end of the 16th century, early 17th century, there are insurrections in Hungary led by Protestant princes, and they request Ottoman military help and military aid. Sometimes the Ottomans would help. This is Bocskai and later Bethlen, who is the Prince of Transylvania, but sometimes they do not. And again, I want to warn you against this too centralized nature of the Ottoman Empire and this state-centered historiography. We have, and I mentioned these examples, that there are two pashas, two governors in Hungary. One supports the Protestant prince's fight against the Catholic Habsburgs, the other opposes that. Because you have networks, these guys have their own alliances at the frontier and they disagree. And it's not just one such. The Ottomans, if you look at the Qadi, that is the Ottoman judges, sometimes they prefer one denomination, sometimes they prefer the others. And the locals are manipulating that. If someone complains, goes to one Qadi, gets a ruling which is not favorable for him, he would go further until he gets a more favorable. So I want you to take into consideration the complexity on the ground. It's not the same as a central government. There is no policy of the Ottoman Porte. There is no policy, there is no such thing. There is no Ottoman strategy. Strategy is made by people, Grand Viziers. They come with their own ideas. There is factionalism at the center. There is factionalism at the provinces. There are networks, and there are local policies that need to be taken into consideration.
Thank you so much. This is really eye-opening, because I had a very simplistic understanding of the same problem. I thought it was just pure support for the Protestants and the Lutherans, but apparently it's much more complicated, and that's very helpful to know. So I will let Professor Salzer and SH speak soon, but let me just first give space for Şefkat Hocam, Şefkat Pamuk. Şefkat Pamuk is one of the most prominent historians of the Ottoman Empire, and he's also a trained economist as well. So Professor Şefkat Pamuk is Professor of Economics and Economic History at the Ataturk Institute of Modern Turkish History, Boğaziçi University. So I'll let you, would love to hear your take, and then I'll yield the floor to Professor Salzer and SH.
Thank you, Faisal. Thank you, Gabor. Wonderful book. I really look forward to reading it. And I am interested in the economic and fiscal basis of Ottoman military power, as you could imagine, one of my favorite topics. And one comment you made intrigued me. You said that while there was the transformation in Europe towards the military fiscal state, the Ottomans remained a limited monarchy. Would you care to expand on that a little bit? Is it your period? When did this happen? What is your take on that?
Mm-hmm. So what I mean, if you look at the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire has a military potential of 100, 125, or if you put the auxiliaries, 160. Of this, Suleiman regularly, who himself personally led 13 campaigns, on many of these campaigns against Hungary, most of his campaigns were against Hungary and Europe, he would mobilize 60, 70,000 soldiers. The composition of these soldiers is very interesting. About 75% of this army are provincial cavalry paid by the military prebends or military fiefs called the Timar. Only about 20-25% are the central standing troops, most of them janissaries, but also artillerymen and others. And the strengths of the Ottomans, I think, lay in the prebendal system, the Timar system. This is what gave them the bulk of their military. But this is the time when the Ottoman government controls about 1/2 of the revenues, and uses it to pay the largest household. This is a patrimonial empire, after all, the largest household of the Sultan. We have the 1520s data. This is something like 27,000 members. Of this, 15,000 are soldiers, but also the servants in the palace, stables, and so on and so forth. None of the contemporary empires or neighbors of the Ottomans were capable of putting on the ground 60, 70,000 professional army, because I consider the Timariots professional army as well. And it was under the direct control of the Sultan, as long as this prebendal system is working. There's only one time when the Habsburgs were capable to put on the ground a similarly large army, and this is 1532, when they mobilized the empire's forces and the Habsburg monarchy's forces. If you look at the 17th century, now the Habsburgs are capable of bringing an army against the Ottomans at the end of the 17th century in the range of 80 to 100,000. What happened in the Ottoman Empire at the same time? They would increase the military potential. We have account books of the armies that were marching against the Habsburgs in 1697, 98. And 98 is after a major defeat against the Habsburgs. And they still were capable of mobilizing around 90,000 soldiers. But the composition of this military is rather different. About half of this military are standing troops, and the standing professional army paid from the central treasury. The previously dominating Sipahis, who provided 75% of Suleiman's army, now about 15%. It had to do with the decreasing value of these provincial cavalries. The Timar system is still in use, but the Timar system is used differently. Starting in the late 16th century, when the Timariot dies, previously they would give it to another Timariot. Now they are not giving it to another Timariot. They are attaching it to the Hasses, the imperial crown lands, so that the imperial crown lands would generate more revenue to finance the gradually increasing central army. Or they would give it to provincial governors, attach it to certain revenue groups, mukatas or others, and those would be given to tax farmers. Very often the tax farmers are the same local notables. And what you have by this time, by the mid-17th century, the Ottoman central government, as a consequence of this transformation, controls only about 24% of the total revenue of the empire. Previously, we thought about that that's a wrong course, that's a mistake. But I argue that that revenue the central government didn't lose that revenue. It was transformed. That revenue still supported armies, the rising kapuhalke, that is the private armies of the provincial governors and the local strongmen. They were responsible for maintaining an army. This army, in a way, replaces the old Sipahi army, the provincial cavalry army. And they would bring their soldiers into the military, into the campaigns. And so it's a different composition, but by what I call military devolution and fiscal decentralization, it was the only way, I think, that the Ottomans were still capable of producing the numbers. and even increasing the number of soldiers who were mobilized against the Habsburgs. So whereas the Habsburgs move from a decentralized state towards a more centralized, the Ottomans just the opposite. They were the most centralized in the 16th century, but they became decentralized. This system still produces the numbers, but it cannot produce the quality of the soldiers, as I see it. I have records of, so there is this register book that tells you who brought how many soldiers to the 1697 and 1698 campaign. And there are guys, Mustafas and Mahmeds, who are bringing 50 soldiers. They even recorded that so-and-so from the province, I don't know what southeastern province, was bringing 50 soldiers. Imagine that you have an army whose composition is so different. They spoke different languages. There is not a single language of common. There is no consistent training. Their weaponry is sourced locally. The quality of the weaponry is very different. They stood no chance to fight against a more centralized army, which was better led, because the Habsburgs by that time had very, very capable generals. Eugene of Savoy being one of those. We don't have Eugene of Savoys in the Ottoman Empire. So this is what I mean by military devolution and fiscal decentralization. And one more thing, and I know that you do that, and I read your studies with great interest. So we make these comparisons between the Ottomans and the European states in terms of the revenue. And you made a very good point that compared to even the small Dutch Republic, I mean, the size-wise, but it was a very wealthy country, but France or the Habsburgs or the Russians later, the Ottomans' revenues in comparative terms are declining. You know, and I looked at some comparative studies in the 1770s, the revenues of the Ottoman Empire and Russia are comparable if you measure it in tons of silver. By the end of the century, in 30 years, one generation, it's 7 to 9 or 10 times larger in the case of Russia. Of course, and they had a different, and Ginny knows it better, a different recruitment system. So they producing more numbers. The Ottomans stood no chance against that army as well. But I think when we want to calculate the total revenue of the Ottomans, we have to take into considerations the provincial treasuries. I looked at these provincial treasuries, which are about a dozen. And if you call the revenues of those provincial treasuries never reach the central treasury account books. And the military, which is maintained by those provincial revenues, never make the books of the total army. So when we want to calculate the number of military potential, we have to look at those. And when we want to calculate the revenues administered by these provincial revenues, we have to add that to the provincial, to the central revenue as well. And that's almost about the same as the revenue administered by the central treasury. If you add all those, Buda and Uivar and and Baghdad and all the others. So I think if we do that, we are going to have a better sense of what the Ottomans were capable of.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gabor. I have to mention that also Professor Agoston compares the devolution of the Ottoman army and fiscal policy, not only with the Habsburgs, but you see the opposite thing in Russia as well, under Peter the Great and Catherine the Great as well. But yeah, so Professor Salazar, you have a question?
Thanks, Faisal. And I apologize if you had covered this. I was coming from class, so I arrived a little bit late. I'm one of the medieval historians in our department here at Penn State. So I would like to ask a question of the 13th and 14th centuries. I'm a continental historian, but I teach the Byzantine history and I teach the Crusades. And when I'm teaching the crusading histories, I mention the Ottomans and I discuss the Ottomans, but then I usually go back to the Fatimids and the Seljuks. And so what my question is, when we're looking at the Seljuks and the Ottomans in the 13th and 14th century, and again, I apologize if you answered this already or talked about it, what is giving the Ottomans the advantage in the long term, in that longue durée, compared to the Seljuks? Because if you just look at it in the short term, the Seljuks have a much, stronger foothold in Anatolia. And so my question, is it military? Is it economic? What ultimately gives the Ottomans the advantage? And I know you could write a dissertation on that or another book, but thank you very much.
So I see certain principles that made the Ottomans different than the Turco-Mongolian empires. One is that in the Mongol Empire, in the Seljuk Empire, the Great Seljuk Empire, I'm not talking about just the Rum Seljuks now, what happens is the patrimony is divided and the sons of the sultans are getting territories as governors, or even the tutors of the sultans, and so on and so forth. I think that in the Ottoman Empire, the notion of the indivisibility of the patrimony, of the controlled by the dynasty, is there by the time of the Battle of Ankara. So when Bayezid is defeated in 1402 by Tamerlane, as you know, he gave back the territories to the Turkoman princes, the emirs in Anatolia, the Karaman, and the others, which the Ottomans had just recently subjugated. And the remaining Ottoman patrimony is divided among the sons, according to Turco-Mongol practice. But the Ottomans do not accept that. They started a war for 10 years in order to establish who is going to rule over all the patrimony. When one of these princes, Mehmed I, managed to establish himself as a sole ruler over the patrimony, there is an emissary, Shahrukh, the successor of Timur, comes and says, "What are you doing? This is not what we are doing. This is not the custom." And Mehmed responded, "Maybe this is your custom, but this is not the Töre Osmani. This is not the custom of the Ottomans." So I use it, and there's this famous law code of Mehmed about the fratricide. Some historians, Colin Imber, thinks that that's a much later fabrication from the late 16th century. But whether is there by Mehmed, I think it's there. The notion of the indivisibility of the patrimony is already there by then. The Ottomans were lucky because the crucial institutions, which are called the pillars of this state, are already established by the time of the Battle of Ankara. And this is the Timar system. You can say that, but the Seljuks had the Ikta, so that's true. But they also had the Janissary Corps and the Devshirme. So there are certain institutions, certain principles of governance which are there and were not there for the Seljuks. This is one thing. The other is the context and where the Ottomans emerge. And I'm going to share my screen just briefly to show you this map. So this is the Ottoman Principality, the Beylik, and Karaman, which considered itself in many ways the successor of the Seljuks because they were ruling from Konya, and many of these principalities are the so-called maritime principalities, they had a navy, they traded. So you would think that those are stronger, but you know, the location mattered because the Ottomans, whereas these guys are fighting against each other and against the Ottomans, it didn't require any novelty. The Ottomans who are fighting against the Byzantines, they had to learn how to besiege fortresses, how to besiege towns. It gave them more booty, more revenue. It forced them to change their tactics, their military, the composition of the military, offered opportunities, what I call military acculturation, and these guys had less of that. Some of these, you know, the Aydin, they were fighting for the Byzantines, they were against the Slavs, for instance, and so were the Ottomans. So the location, the certain institutions, and the Ottomans were just lucky. So I mentioned that, you know, prior to the Ottomans crossed the Dardanelles in the mid 14th century. By that time, there is no major power in Southeastern Europe. The Byzantine Empire is weakened. The great medieval states of Serbia or Bulgaria were divided into smaller principalities. So there is no single force. The next force is medieval Hungary, which at this time is comparable in terms of population, in terms of revenues. But by the time the Ottomans reach Hungary, the Ottomans outpaced the Hungarians in terms of territory, in terms of revenues, and so on and so forth. And I have some tables to show that. So I think these are the differences. And of course, these Seljuks, you can see the Seljuks, this is the situation around 1300. And the Mongol invasion that reaches this geography in 1243 at the Battle of Kusada. After that, there is a power vacuum, and the Seljuks are not the Seljuks of the past, and the emergence of all these small principalities, of which the Ottomans would be the winners. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
In brief, Professor Agoston has a multi-causal explanation. So it's not just one monocausal. And that's my understanding of his approach in general to history. Always look for other and even consider luck and fortune as a factor in how history evolves. But
you have to grab this opportunity. So we all mentioned you know, the earthquake that, for instance, demolished the Gallipoli, the walls of Gallipoli, and then the Ottomans move in, and this would become their bridgehead into Europe in 1354, and it would become their first naval bases and shipbuilding site. They just inherited from the Byzantines, and now the expert Byzantine shipwrights are making ships for the Ottomans. So you needed, because other, you know, I mentioned Umur Bey and Aydins, they had been hired by the Byzantine emperors as auxiliaries, as were the Catalans and others, but they seem to be satisfied with the payment. The Ottomans wanted more. They wanted land. They wanted to stay. So there is a different logic and different tactics, and they stay in Gallipoli, and so I think those things are important. And we talked about the Holy War and others. So when you are fighting against brother Turks and brother Muslims, it's very difficult to portray yourself. They did it. You know, the phraseology, the propaganda that the Ottomans are the sultans of the Ghazis, they are the Mujahid, that is those who are carrying out the jihad, or the Murabit, who are the defenders of Islamdom's borders. It's not just the Ottomans. All their contemporary challengers are using the same phraseology. And I have some examples from mosque inscriptions that their neighbors are using. But the Ottomans are really fighting against the infidel, you know, if you will. But in this context, I think I still don't understand Gaza, honestly, but I liked what Linda Darling recently said, that a war that started not as Gaza would become Gaza later. And this is something similar, what you see in politics nowadays. So as far as the Ottomans are fighting the Byzantines, maybe it's not Gaza, because they are cooperating with the Byzantines as well. There is trade relations, they are neighbors. But when they started to fight against the Bulgarians, the Serbians, the Crusaders at the Battle of Nikopol, these are infidel crusaders. Then they really thought of themselves as crusaders. And all these other guys couldn't give examples similar to the Ottomans. So, and they are very, very expert to use that. They are using, it's not the cause of the rise of the Ottomans, as Paul Wittek said, but it's a very good tool to use it for legitimacy and loyalty creation, and to bring people under your banner.
Wonderful. By the way, as Professor Agoston talks, I see his room, and I remember the many hours I heard him talk, and makes me really miss those days. So SH, I see that you have a question, and we're coming close to 4. That will be 1 hour and a half, and I want to make sure that it's Friday afternoon. If you have if anyone has questions, so I'll try to pack them so we can answer them before 4. So we let everybody go by 4, right?
Okay. Thank you so much for the super interesting talk, Professor Agoston. And I'm really struggling to kind of fill out, which question I want to ask the most. But I guess the one question that I want to ask the most, kind of pulling it back to the more parts that's beyond just the work of a historian, kind of, touches upon the realm of, the political demands and the, social discourses as well. Could you just talk a little bit more about just kind of trials and tribulations of being an Ottoman historian from Hungary in the day and age of this kind of a European right-wing populist movements? Especially, I remember from, one semester when I was teaching a class that I used the example of, Kosovo and the Rohingya conflict in Burma as an example to the students, and just showing you those maps of different ethnic makeup of those regions historically. And none of them made sense to my American students. That this notion that because X region was, X percent, certain ethnicity hundreds of years ago, that this kind of, translates a political claim to the region. So I was wondering if you could just talk about that experience of being an Ottoman historian in this particular age, and how that plays into this idea of a history continuing to shape our political and collective consciousness. And is there a way forward? I mean, is there a way to kind of for things to become better for academics and for this kind of cosmopolitan studies?
Thank you very much. That's a very difficult question. And we struggle with that. History is very popular in every of these countries. There are on the national TV in these countries, you can have 2 historians talking boring topics and people are watching. In Turkey, Şevket Bey knows more about that, but there are several journalists / popular historians who have their own program, the lessons of history and the like, and they invite historians and they talk. It's books that are published. One of my former students, who has a very good book about the spies of the Sultan, it's in its 10th edition. And if you happen to be on TV, the next day on the tram or the bus, people would go to you, oh, Hocam, I saw you last night. So it's part, and so history really matters, and historical memory matters, and it's everywhere. So lately, I wanted to ask my students to look at the gaming. I do not do the gaming, but I heard that there is a whole world out there, and the Ottomans are part of that. That there are these games, the reenactment, all the soap operas about the Ottomans, and these are popular in all the so-called successor states. We have grandmas watching Suleiman and the Magnificent from Slovakia to Greece to Pakistan. Imran Khan's favorite show is about Abdul Hamid II. So now we have not just the historians, there are so many layers, the gaming, heavy metal bands are having songs about the Crusades. There is a song about the winged hussars who who saved Vienna in
Yes.
1683. So it's so complicated. There's so much. There are the historians, there are the politicians, there are the politicians are making certain days of commemorative events of their respective, victories against the enemy, and so on and so forth. Now, it's not totally fabricated, because the 16th century is the time when you can call it proto-nationalism. People talk about the patria. People use, the Ottomans, and this is what I wanted to do. That religion becomes important. The Ottomans really thought, even in the 17th century, of themselves. The Bosnian Pasha would say that he is on the border of Islam, the Sarhadi Islam, and the soldiers who are defending that are the Asakir Islam, the soldiers of Islam. So this rhetoric is there, and I think many thought that seriously about it. And the other side, they thought of themselves as, and they were willing to die for the patria, for the homeland, or the motherland, or the fatherland rather, and the church. So, and I think we, in this more secular state, we don't understand how important religion was. Professor Salter knows in the context of the Crusades that everything, religion was everywhere. People were thinking that the air that they were breathing, that was sin, and so I think we have to try to read the contemporary sources and take this phraseology, seriously. And unfortunately, politicians use and abuse history to their own advantages. So our role as historians, I think, to be, I don't like objective, because we have our own biases, but to show the complexities. History is never black and white, and there are no monocausal explanations. The same guy who is writing that he is fighting for the patria against the infidel Turks, the same frontier governor in Hungary is exchanging very friendly letters with the Ottoman commander and calls him a dear friend, and they are sending fruits and merchandise, and the soldiers are on the Hungarian side, they are copying the Ottomans and their garments, for instance, because it's fashionable. So I think as historians, we have to show the complexity of the past. The complexity of the present is very similar. So I don't have better suggestion, but this is what I try to do. And it's not enough to look at the center, look at the provinces, look at the ordinary guys who are negotiating borders, who are negotiating with the other side.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This is wonderful, Professor Agoston, and I cannot think of a better way to conclude this conversation. And I wholeheartedly agree. If we don't make an effort as historians to make an effort to make our work accessible to the general public, to speak to the general public, if we don't take on this responsibility, then we give room and space to charlatans and demagogues to abuse history and use it to their political ends, whether on the media, on television, and parliaments around the world. And this is, I think, what part of the mission that I see Professor Agoston doing with this book, the first book in English, and of course he has other books published in Hungarian and Turkish. The first book was very academic and intended for people like me and you guys. But the Last Muslim Conquest is part of this mission, is that it's time for us to do our part and make our work accessible. Thank you so much, Professor Agoston, and thank you everybody for showing up. It's been a pleasure. Please give a big round of applause to Professor Agoston. We wish you were here to share ice cream with you in the creamery, but next time, okay? We want to give you proper Pennsylvania hospitality. With that, have a wonderful weekend, guys, and hope we will meet you next Monday. We have Committee for Early Modern Studies has an event with Professor Jyoti Balachandran. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you very much. Thank you.